seeing through the seeing. You know, it takes a while. Yeah, a group of us from Magnum began a project called Postcards from America about almost 2 years ago, in which we first traveled together, a group of 5 of us in an RV across the border from Texas to California. And the second project was to locate in Rochester for 2 weeks and live in a house and splay out and see what we found. And quite late we were there 2 weeks, and at the end of the first week I heard about some Latino women working there, and I was interested in that community. Walked in and didn't want to leave. Just was fascinated. I mean, fascinated because it wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I even imagined. I hadn't fully visualized it, but walking around, I was just really intrigued that so many people from so many different parts of the world were there in this one box of a factory and all together making one thing. Kind of seemed, I don't know, amazing, fascinating. So I've gone back since that first time, which was about a year ago, and continuing to think about there's a deep history, so the historical elements are yet to be discovered. You know, I've done begun the interviewing, begun to look at the Hickey Freeman collection of historical photographs. It's over 100 years old, so there are lots of layers to consider. Perfect example, to make discoveries, to be curious, to make connections that you can't pre-visualize. So I'm sort of on the other end of the spectrum of not knowing when you enter the world what you'll come back with and how it'll impact you. And so that's, to me, what real documentary work is. It takes you places you can't fully imagine going. Well, helped or hindered. I mean, you are who you are, so you have to start with that. So, but I know that certainly in my early work, being a young woman looking at women in the carnival strippers period was very strong and continues to be there as a kind of, let's say, not in, maybe not always in a predictable way, but certainly, or in the sense of trying to set a pattern and define what I do through that lens only. But I think it probably influences everything. My approach, my way of being, is that feminine or, obviously I work, when I'm following a military patrol, I have limitations. You know, I can't keep up in the same way maybe. So I have both, that's why I think advantages and disadvantages. But in terms of your sensibility, I don't think it's only a feminine sensibility. I don't know. I mean, there are very specific ways in which I would say would distinguish myself, but I wouldn't, you know, in terms of how I might work. Not carrying a lot of gear, not feeling I need a lot to build relationships, you know. But it's as philosophic as it is maybe gender related. Well, I always have this problem because I don't start thinking I'm a photojournalist. I think, you know, the work I did was project related and it wasn't tied to any magazine production. So that's really important, even though magazines at one point become the medium of distribution. It's a different kind of orientation if you're working on an assignment for somebody to produce something, or you're looking out at the world and trying to figure out where it could live. So I'm thinking of space where something can live. Space could be physical, could be two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Installation is a very different thing than a page spread. So I'm much more comfortable with book form or installation form. But obviously when I was in Central America, I mean, there were very few women working in the field, and they're more present now than certainly I had. There were writers more than there were photographers in the late 70s in Central America, or into even the early 80s. That's great. I think women have a lot to contribute to the field on their own terms. So I think, I see women very present in the work, not necessarily always in the curated spaces that they might deserve to be. Whether it's collections or, I think that's another issue. But the work and the working lives of women are much more present than they were 30, 40 years ago. Yeah, I know. I was just looking at the slideshow, and I know that it is very disparate to those who might define their work differently. I think it's all coming from encounters of different kinds. So I see the archive of work very much in my own body, changing, thinking, imagining, all of it. It feels connected. It feels like it's part of who I am or I've come to be. So, I see connections that maybe other people don't. I think obviously I change formats. I work from black and white to color. I work from 35 millimeter to panoramic to 6/7. I mean, I don't think those are just choices that have to do with how you're trying to render and make sense of something. I tend to go back over time at different points in the history of a project, or maintain relationships that may not be visible yet in photographs but are there underneath. So those are consistencies that but I would never say I'm a color photographer, or I'm a woman photographer, or I'm a war photographer. None of those. If you put those boxes, I don't want to fit into any of them. I want to just be able to respond and be curious and make discoveries. The projects evolve in different ways and different patterns. I mean, I would never guess that when I first went to Nicaragua, I'd be doing a project that had a lifetime of over 25 years. I mean, you can't know that. And there's other work that is like a one-night stand. It was great, it was intense, and it's over. So what the thing that's so fascinating about photography is what draws you in if you're truly free to explore that way, and what holds you, what keeps you, what makes you engage more deeply. I like the mystery of that. I don't always know. It takes me a while to know what stays with me, where I'm still thinking, trying to figure out something. The Prince Street Girls, which I'm going to show, which hasn't ever been published, and is really work that I did when I was right on the cusp of doing strippers. So during the better known work became a book, and a lesser known work is something that I'm still thinking about, and I still have relationships with women I knew when they were 8 years old, and now they're nearly 50. So that's kind of wild. And maybe there'll be a form. So I think this thing about form, or finding space for work, is really important. And it's not necessarily driven by a timeline that has a logic, except that you feel at a certain moment it's ready, you put a parenthesis around it, you create a book or something. At age 60, Magnum really together decided, as a group of photographers, that facing this next very dramatically shifting world, that documentary photographers were going to really need support of different kinds than we had. I mean, we had partners in a number of ways, and when you talk about photojournalism and I talk about distribution, it was significant to have partners in production through the media, which we really no longer have in a significant way as we did. So the concept was to see whether or not there were other ways to support work. So the Magnum Foundation is really small. It's kind of just 5 years old. It's I'm kind of astounded by how much we do for such a small team. It's supporting I would say the ideals of Magnum, the values of Magnum photographers over the time of 65 years now as a collective of photographers working, and looking outward. I mean, we can't support more photographers internally, so it's really seeing what else that history can bring to the next generations. So I think of it as being very consistent with kind of everything I've done, and hoping to be able to think about ways that those values can survive in a very difficult landscape. So those values being long-term work, in-depth work, independent work, outside of the partners that might distribute the work, the production of the work, in the kind of critical thinking that I hope photographers can sustain. So that's the emergency fund. And then the other piece was Magnum photographers wanting that archive that's very rich, which used to support a lot of nonprofit partnering in ways that we can't, that are there to be explored. So the archive is activated through the foundation. And that's exciting. That's exciting. That's leading us into lots of new relationships. I think it's great that everybody may want to be a photographer, but it's the language of photography. Is it moving forward? Are we exploring new relationships through photography? That's where, I'm particularly interested in my own work and in others that express an approach that involves subjects differently or communities differently through the photography, not just making images of and plastering them or sharing them. Sharing in what ways? What kinds of dialogues can we create through photography? I hope that's what we can continue to support. I think if I ever, when young people ask me, what should I do or how do I do what I want to do? First, it's what do you want to do? What can you feel some passion about that you just have to do? And then what do you have to do what you want to do? Obviously those are all related. How committed are you to exploring, discovering, trying to make sense of something? And I think the danger is that we can service as photographers very easily. Somebody needs something. The question is, when you're faced with, you walk around, how do you see through what's visible, the surfaces of things, work with the surface and get beyond that surface? That's the big challenge. So, and that's an ongoing challenge. As much experience as you might have, that's always the challenge. How do you get beyond, you look at the surface, and how do you at the same time reveal behind the surface and through the surface? So when I speak to young photographers, I love the enthusiasm, and then I want to know how hard they're willing to work to understand what they've seen and to help contextualize what they've seen so that it adds to my seeing, And it's interesting because, I used to think, you had to go someplace to know about it. And it's still problematic for me. I can read the newspaper and online and see there's a lot to see now. It's overwhelming. So who brings me into that world that I'm looking at through the window of the photograph, the frame of the photograph, such that I feel like I'm behind it, not just looking at it? That's challenging. Doesn't have to be the same approach of an immersive experience, which is maybe my approach, but there are moments that I know I am seeing through someone else seeing something I wouldn't have seen. I'm still as curious, but my time is more divided. I mean, the foundation is a big piece of time. But when I walk around and around and around the floor of a factory that has 450 people working in it and 4 different floors, back and forth, and get excited that I saw something on the floor that I didn't see 2 hours before, I'm excited, you know. Seeing through the seeing, you know, it takes a while. And I'm, you know, challenged to see how much further I can see and hear. You know, there's a lot of listening. Not just to the machinery, but, you know, one of the things is to understand the history of a place that you can't see in the time that you're living because it's present. So feel the past and see the present. That's challenging.